Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Katie, do you have anything you want to start with this morning? How about questions from the class? Anything on your minds as we get started here? While you're thinking about that a little bit, let me do a few quick things as far as current events are concerned. It turns out you probably already know that this is National Pharmacy Week. And so that's pretty cool. That's right down the center of the lane for you folks. It also happens to be National Chemistry Week, and nice that those two are aligned with each other since they're so uh, much dependent upon each other and related to each other. American Chemical Society often does a lot of different things, activities and so on during National Chemistry Week, and I'm not exactly sure what's going on with that this year. Dr. Nick Natali is usually the best source of information about American Chemical Society matters, and I know in recent years he's done some activities on certain uh, aspects of National Chemistry Week. So I'm not sure if he's doing anything like that this year or not. Um, also, relative to our conversation toward the end of the hour yesterday when we were talking about regulatory aspects of cannabis. And we were talking about voting and all those things. It, it reminded me about probably most of you folks that plan on voting. If you haven't voted already, you're probably already registered. But if you're not registered, um, in the state of Montana, you can register clear into voting day itself. Um, but if you've ever been through that process on the last day, it can be pretty long. You might end up standing in a line for a very long time. And often, of course, the weather is a little bit nasty by about then. So it can be a long, cold wait. Um, would certainly encourage people who aren't uh, registered now but want to vote to register ahead of time. And there's multiple opportunities to do that between now and in the election, just short of 2 weeks away now. By the way, along those lines, I don't know if you've noticed the national statistics or not, but a tremendous amount of people are voting ahead of time. And I think as of yesterday nationally, something like in the range of 30 plus million people have already voted, which is uh, on par for a really record breaking vote if those numbers stay where they are right now. So the vote is underway and will be continuing over the next now just a little bit less than 2 weeks. If you're unsure about how to go about the process of registering to vote, if you're not there and what you want to, um, and and you're planning on voting out of Missoula, you can go to the Missoula County website, and there's information there, or the state of Montana website, or a variety of other organizations. I'd be willing to bet, although I'm not sure, that Montberg on campus probably has voter registration information. Um, it's not a very involved process, but it does require just a little bit of planning to get it done. So it's a tough deal if you want to vote and you end up not being registered and can't vote because of that. That's a bummer. So please consider registering ahead of time and perhaps even voting ahead of time, like so many people across the nation are already doing. So it'll be kind of fun over the next couple of weeks to keep track of that, and I'll try to stay in touch with that and see what we're doing nationally in terms of voting ahead of time. There's all sorts of dynamics associated with that voting ahead of time in terms of various potential outcomes in the election. We don't need to get into that here, but it's kind of an interesting phenomenon overall. Okay, enough rambling by me in terms of voting. Anybody come up with questions or comments, additional ideas about the sort of political aspects of cannabis, like we were talking about yesterday? Okay, well, let me give you just a preview of where we're going to be over the next couple of weeks in class as we approach the election and then have the election. Today, both sessions today, we're going to devote to continuing coverage with respect to the autonomic nervous system, which we had started into, but I did not complete before we pushed in the clutch a little bit and changed gears and had Katie take over so marvelously for a while. The sympathetic system is one of the really important classical areas of pharmacology. So we'll go through it pretty slowly, really, and I will be asking, but not demanding, of course, input from you folks with respect to various autonomic topics as we go along. So that'll be pretty much today in the double lecture today. Then on Thursday, tomorrow, we'll do some more with degenerative brain diseases, taking cue from what a nice job Katie did last week with Parkinson's disease and dopamine. And the beginnings of that lecture tomorrow on degenerative diseases will quickly review Parkinson's. And I think you'll find it really a cinch to latch onto that topic since it's been so adequately described by Katie previously. And then next week, we'll have some really central nervous system related pharmacology topics, starting with the antipsychotic drugs, which is probably a more prominent area than one might imagine ahead of time, because there are not only a lot of direct applications of antipsychotics, but there are applications in other areas of interest. And in a classification sense, if a particular drug is sort of typically labeled as an antipsychotic drug, and an individual is taking that drug, it doesn't necessarily mean that individual is suffering from psychoses. It could be for other reasons that the antipsychotic drug is being utilized. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the other indications for antipsychotics. as well as the indications that are relevant to the naming of that particular category. It's a category with really interesting history, and in many ways relatively recent history, because there really were no frank antipsychotic drugs uh, available from sort of standard pharmaceutical sources until about the mid 1950s. And then there were some revolutions that occurred in pretty rapid sequence that brought antipsychotic drugs to the forefront of psychiatric practice. And so we'll talk about some of those historical things and controversies surrounding them. So it's a really pretty fascinating area to discover. Um, After that, we'll talk about antidepressant drugs. And, this is a huge category anymore. And we'll discover that depression was, for many years, both in a pharmaceutical sense and a non-pharmaceutical sense, was undertreated. And in many ways, the field has kind of come closer, or at least caught up with that a bit here in the last 2 or 3 decades. And once again, there are multiple indications for drugs that we call antidepressant drugs, not just depression itself. So we'll try to look at that in a little bit broader sense, perhaps moving a little bit beyond the realm of DSM described depression. And then finally, before we hand the baton back to Katie again in a couple of weeks, we'll take a look at the opioids. And as we've discussed a little bit before, you cannot find a more classical pharmacological area than the opioids. And if you go to PubMed or one of the other citation indices, you'll find a huge number of references associated with better understanding the pharmacology of the opioidal substances. And so it's a deeply rich area as far as a history of pharmacology is concerned. And of course, that's related to the fact that the opioid drugs are, on the one hand, so substantially efficacious in terms of dealing with severe pain, as well as some other characteristics. And at the same time, of course, bring along a lot of liability with them. And we've all been well aware of many of the controversies associated with those liabilities here in recent years, locally, nationally, and internationally. Really, it's really not just a United States sort of issue, but associated with world pharmacology and therapeutics. So those are the main events that we'll be discussing over the next couple of weeks. It's never too early, I guess, to be thinking about exams. We just finished one up, so you're probably sick about hearing things like that. But 3 days after the election on November 6th, we have our third exam, and we'll let you know well ahead of time in the next week or so exactly where we'll cut that off in terms of current coverage and some of the things that we'll be covering in the immediate days in front of that exam will actually end up on exam 4. And it is amazing. Somebody was mentioning yesterday, boy, just take a look at the calendar. We're approaching an end quite rapidly to this abbreviated semester that we're having. And in fact, I believe yesterday was the 20th of October, and our last exam in this course is on the 20th of November. So that's just one month away. Um, I think that the thing to really take note of in that particular regard is that exam 3 and then the so-called final, it really isn't really a final, it's just a fourth regular exam, um, come up pretty close to each other. So we won't have a really huge period in between exam 3 and exam 4. And as everyone is aware of, things do start to get crunched as we get towards the end of any given semester. And I have a feeling that's even more likely to be the case this semester, with the semester unfolding in such a rapid fashion. So as much as we might not want to think about it, there are a couple of exams in our very near future. And as I go along through our material here in the next few days, I'll certainly be making frequent reference to the exams and some sort of strategic sorts of things that, from a student standpoint, that you can think about in terms of facilitating the taking of those particular exams. So that's our outlook for upcoming weeks. And I'll pause for a moment here to see if anybody has come up with any questions or has any comments that you would like to make relative to what we've just talked about. Okay, well, one thing that and I'm not sure if everybody heard it or not, because I was rambling on about things yesterday and we were pushing time. So at the very end, I encouraged people to take a look at the previous PowerPoint. And everybody see the black cat's with me today. I don't know if you saw her, she just stretched. She's sitting in the window behind me. And she's in profile now and getting ready to put her head down and go back to sleep again. Anyway, as we were wrapping up yesterday, I encouraged people to try to take a look at the parasympathetic system PowerPoint. And I don't know if anybody had a chance to do that or not, but the reason that I wanted you to do it is, of course, to be able to easily contrast the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems. And I thought it might be nice to just take a quick review on the parasympathetic side. So keep that in mind as ask a few questions here coming up. And first, let me advance slides a little bit here. Got a few things to hopefully soothe everybody today with all this talk about end of semester and exams and elections and all those things. For you Coloradans out there, you probably recognize the Maroon Bells, a spectacular mountain range in the sort of interior of Colorado. And so I thought this scene was particularly tranquil and probably taken about this time of year or so, looking at the foliage out there. Switching gears a lot to manatees in South Florida. The manatee is extraordinarily relaxed, seemingly anyway, extraordinarily relaxed creature. And in the United States, anyway, the major collection of manatees is anywhere from about Central to South Florida. And this time of year, as temperatures are beginning to drop off a little bit, the manatees make their way as far south as they can get, because they're extraordinarily sensitive to temperature differences. And as warm as we all think Florida is, it's just barely warm enough for a manatee, as they really thrive on warm to almost hot ocean temperatures. So I've always thought they were pretty cool creatures. And if the world is running a little bit too fast for you, you might want to advance to a manatee slide to think about a pretty slow moving organism. This picture here, I can't remember who gave it to me. I wish I could lay claim to it myself, but I can't. Um, it's just always been one of the most remarkable photos to me. And if you want to imagine it, we can think that the owl is waving at us there and saying, "Relax if you can." Uh, but I'm in full flight right now, so that's another pretty cool picture. Tara is one of our family cats. It doesn't live in our household, but lives with one of our daughters, and she's getting ready, I think, to jump up into the chair for a little relaxation and sleep, perhaps, which you can see the sleep unfolding in this particular photo here. So hopefully, I won't put everybody to sleep with these things, but I thought a little bit of appropriate relaxation might be in order before we go to this, which was Francis when he definitely was not relaxed. And whether you're a human being, a manatee, an owl, or a cat, um, you have autonomic nervous system, and the prominence of that autonomic function in the various creatures, of course, does vary, but it's an important aspect of overall homeostasis for all organisms of this type. And I don't know if you can see her or not, but Olivia's going back to sleep in the window behind me, and sort of the homeostasis in her system right now is very likely very much toward the parasympathetic side, and especially in the sense that just before we got online here today, she had a little bit of a brunch, I guess we would call it. So her system is very much involved in assimilating those nutrients and storing them and preparing for um, what might be, hopefully this won't happen like this, but what could be a need to mobilize uh, those energetics in a way which would be defensive in terms of perceived threat. Um, so when you're thinking of autonomic pharmacology, um, and now soon to emphasize the sympathetic side of things, uh, try to imagine what is going on inside, because some of it is very visible, like in this slide or this one for that matter. Um, you can tell that the things are going pretty slow if an individual cat or human is sleeping. But think further than that. Think about what's going on inside the sleeping cat. What's going on with the gastrointestinal tract, for example, and as we just talked about, very likely it's quite active. Whereas in the case of Francis, um, very likely his gastrointestinal tract is not at all activated at this point, but rather priorities are being established in his system that are much different than the parasympathetic things. So when I was thinking about our last exam, in which the parasympathetic topics were front and center on that exam, and thinking about challenges that people might have in terms of answering autonomically related questions on that exam, or there will be some on exam 3 also. The sympathetic system, which we're talking about right now, will be fodder for questioning on exam 3. Um, I make the claims, and I know people think I'm sort of crazy for it, but the foundation of understanding of autonomic system pharmacology is very much autonomic system physiology, and to a somewhat lesser extent, autonomic system anatomy. But certainly from the physiological side, you've pretty much got the functional answers in front of you when you think about what's going on, either sympathetically or parasympathetically, as far as the autonomic subdivisions are concerned. And if any of you struggled on the last exam, and there weren't many that did, you did a fantastic job on the exam, everyone. But if you did struggle at all, or even if you didn't struggle but are feeling a little bit insecure about your understanding of various principles of autonomic pharmacology, I really do recommend going back to the physiology, because the sort of cognitive source of strength lies in that physiology. And if you're sort of looking at some things that you need to think about as far as autonomic pharmacology is concerned, you really don't have to think too far if you've got those physiological principles well in mind. So that's one of the reasons why I asked you um, to review the pharmacology PowerPoint on parasympathetic system, was to perhaps use that as a little bit of leverage to even go back to the physiology. So when we ask a question about methacholine, for example, on the parasympathetic side, what we're really doing is asking a question about acetylcholine, at least in terms of its muscarinic uh, aspects. And the same sort of principle when we're thinking about sympathetic system. And if we ask a question about norepinephrine, which we certainly will on the exam, um, we're, um, we're basing our initial understanding of norepinephrine, which is a drug substance, but of course it is also the primary neurotransmitter at the end organs of the sympathetic system. We're really basing our conclusions upon what's going on with respect to the physiology. So I encourage people to think strategically, uh, not only in terms of taking exams, but in terms of studying. And you can practice some of those strategic attempts at understanding autonomic pharmacology by using each other as study partners. And one of you can ask questions about autonomic pharmacology while the other one answers, or if an answer isn't readily available, the two or more of you can work with each other in terms of, well, where do we find out how to answer that particular question. So questions from me typically, and by the way, Katie's approach to questioning was very, very similar to what I would have done with the types of questions that she had. And so I suspect in the upcoming third exam, in which we'll both have questions, we can once again expect the types of questions to be about like what the questions were on this previous exam that we just finished up with. So in terms of strategic approaches, the number one thing that I'm really asking people to do when you come down to it and sort of look at overall what the exam questions meant, is that I'm asking people to classify things. If you see a drug name like methacholine come up, the first thing that I would recommend would be how, go about classifying that substance in terms of what you know. How would you classify it? And there's a number of answers to that, but one answer would be that it's a parasympathetic mimic. So it's a parasympathomimetic. Another answer that you might make is, well, it's a relative of acetylcholine. And in that context of being a relative of acetylcholine, it addresses a specific aspect of the information that acetylcholine brings forward, and that is the muscarinic aspect. So methylcholine is a muscarinic agonist, and you can use that first attempt that you make at classification as a tool for answering the question on the exam. So what does it mean to be an analog of acetylcholine? What does it mean to have parasympathetic properties? And that's where, if you look at that PowerPoint presentation from a couple of weeks ago on the parasympathetic system, try to distill that down to just very few things, and you'll notice on there that from a parasympathetic muscarinic standpoint, that we're basically talking about cardiovascular depression with respect to the parasympathetic side, meaning, of course, that for example, heart rate will likely drop under the influence of an agent like that. Now, also, as one classifies things, you can give you a forum for anomalies that may occur. And just in that cardiovascular realm with respect to parasympathetics, we have an anomaly, because if you look at the physiology of the parasympathetic system, it's certainly a cardiac depressant, but it's not really a vascular depressant, because the parasympathetic system does not innervate. Remember, it does not innervate the vasculature, even though the muscarinic cholinergic receptors are there. So you have a little bit of a split that occurs there in terms of your understanding the physiology and applying that to the pharmacology. For the most part, those sorts of splits don't happen. And most of the things that occur physiologically give you a strong clue of what's going on pharmacologically. But we always have to be a little bit aware of some of those sort of glitches that occur in our understanding of the physiology and pharmacology. So, of course, if the parasympathetic system is depressant as far as cardiovasculature is concerned, the sympathetic system should be just the opposite of that, which we'll see very soon is indeed the case. So let me file through here a little bit, and that brings us to the autonomic square once again. So I don't know how many of you people utilize this little tool or not, or perhaps discovered your own tool to help out. But let me just review quickly what the autonomic, what the trickery of the autonomic square is. If you take the major categories of parasympathetic and sympathetic physiology and pharmacology, it turns out that you've got 4 fundamental drug groups buried within that context: the parasympathetic agonists and antagonists, the sympathetic agonists and antagonists. And if you start anywhere you want on the square, but I usually start at the upper left, put those categories of drugs or physiological transactions at the corners of the square, then as you move from one corner to another, for example, from if you've got um, parasympathetic or muscarinic agonists at the upper left, and right below that in the lower left side, you've got parasympathetic um, antagonists. Then as you move from that one corner to the other, you flip the actions around. Um, Same way as you move from other places that are corners of the square. But if you on a diagonal cross from, for example, parasympathetic agonist in the upper left to um, sympathetic antagonists on the lower right, then that diagonal uh, doesn't really change things very much. Parasympathetic agonists and sympathetic antagonists are pretty much the same thing. They're not exactly so, but they're pretty much so. And so it's always seemed to me that if you understand one area of autonomic pharmacology, such as parasympathetic agonists, you've understood all four of those areas by just appropriately keeping things the same or flipping them upside down. Um, so that's sort of the trickery involved with the autonomic square. And it can unfortunately, every drug category doesn't work as slick as this does. The, the fact that uh, the autonomic systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic, are in contrast to each other, allows us to build such a device as the autonomic square. And without those sorts of aspects to the anatomical and physiological setup of the system, we couldn't as conveniently do that. So I encourage people to think about these relationships and to utilize this the handles that exist in this autonomic square if it works for you. If it doesn't work for you, no big deal. You might want to find another way, however, to sort of traverse as much ground as you can with the square, but utilizing whatever trick you might want to utilize. So let's now move directly into the sympathomimetics or the sympathetic agonists, or sometimes they're called the adrenergic agonists because of the utilizing the British system of naming adrenergics as opposed to the approaches that we take using epinephrine and norepinephrine as particular names. So, and recall from the parasympathomimetic category back a couple of weeks ago that the direct acting agents are drugs that interact directly with the appropriate receptors that go along with your classification scheme. And so, once again, when we think about classification, when you classify or identify a particular drug substance, then the next step in classification is to direct yourself towards a target, one or more targets of that drug, and classify those. And so up in the parasympathetic side, of course, we identified muscarinic acetylcholine receptors as the most likely targets, not the only targets, but the most likely targets for the parasympathomimetics. Similar sort of thing to do on the sympathomimetics. If we've identified a category, well, what about targets? And the targets, of course, would be the main targets would be the adrenergic receptors. Now, as you recall from physiology and from our introduction to autonomics, adrenergics involve two, at this point anyway, in terms of our understanding, and it's been this way for about 100 years, so perhaps it's going to stay that way, two subtypes of adrenergic receptors, the alpha and beta. And I reemphasize that because if you notice at the top of our list here, in terms of physiological substances or drugs, we've listed epinephrine. And you might be scratching your head a little bit about that because you're going, well, that's not the neurotransmitter at sympathetic end organs. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter at those end organs. So why have we listed epinephrine? And the answer to that essentially is in the next line, that epinephrine has what we might describe as full alpha and beta characteristics. Whereas norepinephrine is a little narrower than that. And norepinephrine has full alpha characteristics, but not non-existent, but weaker beta characteristics. So if you want to get this sort of full flavor of alpha versus beta pharmacology, you kind of have to use epinephrine as the prototype, even though it slightly moves us out of the autonomic system to do so. And as you recall, again from physiology, epinephrine is a prominent hormonal substance, which is released from the adrenal medulla. By the way, under the influence of the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system. So there's a very direct tie-in physiologically between and pharmacologically with respect to the neurotransmitter versus the hormonal systems. So epinephrine or adrenaline versus norepinephrine, noradrenaline or norepinephrine is very much at the forefront of our classification scheme at this point. The next thing that you need to think about then in terms of classification, you've got the drug or neurotransmitter classified, you've got one or more targets classified, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Then you need to ask the question, well, functionally, what does that mean? Physiologically or pharmacologically? If we've identified something as an alpha agonist, that means that the drug is directly binding to alpha adrenergic receptors. If it's a beta agonist, then it's directly binding to beta adrenergic receptors, much as we had the direct components back on the parasympathetic side. Well, so what does that mean then? And that's where we get to the functional aspects of things. What do alpha receptors do in terms of the physiology? What do they do in terms of alpha versus beta? And what particular systems within our overall organ system relationship are particularly endowed with alpha versus beta receptors, or for that matter, in comparing sympathetic versus parasympathetic innervation, physiology, and pharmacology. So there's a number of steps that you can take in terms of your classification scheme. So, in terms of identifying alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, of course, we know from what we've already learned physiologically and pharmacologically that we're talking about G protein coupled receptors in these particular cases, and that there are relationships between these receptors because G protein coupled receptors are all related to each other to one degree or another. But on the other hand, there are also differences because to get the full flavor of a muscarinic cholinergic receptor versus an alpha adrenergic or a beta adrenergic, we have to think about some differences that exist within the context of those related receptors. So to me, it's very much a classification thing that we're up to. And as we talked about on the very first day of class, there's a lot of potential strength in classification, but it can also be overdone. And we were talking about that a little bit yesterday as Katie and myself and you folks we're thinking about cannabis and cannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors, and what that means in terms of classification or lack thereof. And then we talked about the fact that cannabidiol can also interact with non-cannabinoid receptors such as the serotonin 1A receptor. So that's a little bit of a switch in terms of classification, but it tells you that as you classify things, you have to have confidence in that classification, but you also have to be wary of it in the sense that it can take you down a pathway that you don't want to go if you're too dogmatic about thinking about that classification scheme. So I think we're probably about out of time. If anybody has any questions now you want to ask, that'd be great. Or we can easily address those as we pick up again here in just one more hour. So anybody have anything right now? Okay, well, go practice parasympathetic physiology then. Have a good lunch, and we'll see you in just a little over an hour. Thank you very much. Take care.